The silence was the first thing that felt wrong. In AB-17 Flying Fortress, silence isn't just an absence of noise, it is a mechanical death knell. Captain Elias Thorne opened his eyes, but the world didn't make sense. His vision was a fractured kaleidoscope of flickering orange light and deep, suffocating gray. There was a sharp, metallic tang in the back of his throat, the taste of copper and spent oxygen. His head throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing heat that felt like a physical hammer striking the inside of his skull. He was sitting in a seat, strapped in by heavy webbing. In front of him was a wall of dials, glass faces, and toggles, all glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. He looked at them, and they looked back like an alien language. He saw needles jumping in circular cages. He saw red lines and green arcs. He knew, instinctively, that these things were important, but the why was gone. "Who am I?" he whispered. The sound of his own voice was foreign, a rasping vibration in a throat raw from screaming he couldn't remember. He looked to his right. There was another seat. It was empty, but not clean. The plexiglass of the co-pilot side window was shattered, and a spray of dark, frozen crimson patterned the seat cushions like a morbid map. A freezing gale of high-altitude wind screamed through the jagged hole, carrying with it the scent of cordite and the thin, biting air of 5 miles up. Elias looked down at his hands. They were encased in heavy, fleece-lined leather gloves. They were resting on a large, black yoke, a U-shaped steering control. He gripped it, and his knuckles turned white. "I am in a plane," he concluded. The realization brought no comfort, only a cold, rising tide of panic. He didn't know where the plane was going. He didn't know where it had come from. Most terrifyingly, he looked at the complex array of throttles, mixture controls, and landing gear levers, and realized he had no idea how to use them. He was a passenger in the pilot seat of a 4-engine bomber, flying over a landscape of clouds he didn't recognize, at a speed that felt like it was tearing the world apart. He reached up to touch his forehead. His hand came away sticky and dark. A piece of flak, the jagged iron shrapnel of anti-aircraft fire, had punched through the fuselage, grazed his flight helmet, and slammed his head against the steel frame of the cockpit. The concussion had been a reset button for his conscious mind. The Elias Thorne, who knew his mother's name, his service number, and the complicated sequence for feathering a failing propeller had been wiped clean. Behind him, through the narrow crawlway to the rest of the ship, there was no sound of crew. No gunners joking over the interphone, no navigator calling out headings. He was a ghost in a machine. The plane began to bank. Slowly, the nose dipped toward the white floor of the clouds below. A warning horn, a piercing, mechanical shriek, began to blare from the dashboard. Elias stared at the red light flashing in synchronization with the horn. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that if the nose kept dipping, the screaming wind outside would eventually tear the wings off. "Think," he hissed, tears of frustration welling in his eyes. "How do I stop it?" But the memory banks were empty. The library of his life had been burned to the ground. He was a man with no history, no identity, and no instructions, hurtling through the stratosphere in a 10-ton coffin of aluminum. He closed his eyes, waiting for the impact, but then, his hands did something his mind couldn't explain. As the B-17's nose dipped further, the groan of the airframe intensified. The altimeter needle was spinning in a blurred counterclockwise circle, shedding thousands of feet. Elias Thorne's conscious mind was a void of static, frozen by the sight of the approaching cloud deck. He was a man drowning on dry land, staring at a control yoke that looked like a jagged piece of abstract sculpture. But then, the biological miracle occurred. Without a conscious command from his bruised frontal lobe, Elias's right hand moved. It didn't hesitate. It reached out and gripped the 4 black knobbed levers in the center pedestal, the throttles. His fingers performed a rhythmic, practiced dance, easing them back just an inch, then adjusting the pitch levers beside them. His left hand, acting with a terrifying, independent intelligence, pulled back on the yoke with a steady, firm pressure. He watched his own limbs as if they belonged to a stranger. He wasn't flying the plane. He was a spectator to a ritual his nervous system had performed 1,000 times. The how-to of flight had been scorched out of his memory, but the how-to had moved into his marrow. This was the cerebellum taking command, the primal, lizard brain part of the mind that stores repetitive motion. The nose of the flying fortress leveled out. The screaming wind outside transitioned into a steady, rhythmic drone. The warning horn cut out, leaving a ringing silence in the cockpit. Elias exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. He looked at his hands, which were still resting comfortably on the controls. They weren't shaking. "How did I do that?" he whispered. He tried to think about the physics of it. Lift, drag, thrust. The words felt familiar, but he couldn't connect them to the levers. If he tried to think about which way to turn the yoke to bank the plane, his mind hit a wall of gray fog. But if he simply looked at a distant cloud and wanted to go toward it, his hands and feet on the rudder pedals moved in perfect, coordinated harmony. It was a neurological schism. The pilot was still alive in his muscle fibers, even if the man was dead in his memories. However, muscle memory has its limits. It can keep a plane level, and it can maintain a cruise, but it cannot navigate. It cannot calculate fuel consumption or understand the complex radio frequencies needed to find home. Elias looked out the window. Below the clouds, he caught a glimpse of a gray, cold sea. He was over water. He didn't know which water. He didn't know if the land beyond the horizon held friends or the very people who had put the shrapnel in his skull. The panic began to return, bubbling up from his stomach. Level flight was a stay of execution, not a pardon. He needed a voice. He needed someone to tell him who he was and where the ground was before the fuel gauges, which he could see were hovering near the red, hit empty. Tentatively, his hand moved again. It reached for a toggle switch on the side of his headset. He didn't know it was the interphone switch, but his thumb found it with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. He clicked it. "Hello?" he croaked into the mask. Can anyone hear me? I don't know where I am. I don't know who I am." Static crackled in Elias's ears, a sharp, electric hiss that felt like needles against his sensitive eardrums. For a long, terrifying minute, there was nothing but the rhythmic thrum of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Then, a voice broke through the fog. It was thin and distorted by distance, but it carried the unmistakable authority of the ground. "Unidentified aircraft on Channel Baker 9er. This is RAF Manston Control. We have you on radar. You are off course and losing altitude. State your identity and intentions, over." Elias gripped the yoke so hard the leather groaned. I don't have an identity," he stammered, his voice cracking. There was an explosion. "My head. I don't know the buttons. My hands are moving, but I don't know why." A long silence followed. At Manston, the controllers likely looked at each other with a mix of disbelief and pity. A Section 8 in the sky, a pilot who had cracked. But the head controller, a man who had seen 1,000 bombers limp home, recognized the flat, toneless cadence of a concussion victim. "Listen to me, Baker 9er," the voice returned, now softer, more deliberate. "We're going to call you Elias. That's the name on your flight plan. You are flying AB 17G. You're about 20 miles out from the coast of Kent. I need you to look at the center of your dashboard. Do you see a dial with a needle and a compass card?" Elias looked. His eyes darted over the dozens of circular glass faces. To his conscious mind, they were just numbers. "I see it," he whispered. "Good. I want you to turn that yoke in your hands to the left. Just a gentle pressure. We need a heading of 280. Watch the needle. When the 28-foot is at the top, level out." The instructions were simple, almost insultingly basic, the kind of thing taught to a cadet on his first hour in a link trainer. But for Elias, it was like learning to breathe again. He followed the voice. He watched the needle. He felt the heavy aircraft bank, the wings tilting against the white horizon. He was an expert beginner. He had the physical grace of a veteran pilot, but the intellectual understanding of a toddler. "You're doing fine, Elias," the controller urged. "Now, look to your right. There is a row of 4 levers with black knobs. Those are your throttles. Pull them back half an inch. We need to lose some speed before we reach the glide path. The interaction was a neurological miracle. The controller was providing the logic, the frontal lobe, while Elias provided the execution, the motor cortex. It was a dual-pilot operation separated by 20 miles of air. The controller didn't tell him how to move his muscles. He just gave the goal, and Elias's subconscious filled in the blanks. But as the coastline of England appeared, a jagged, dark line emerging from the grey sea, the reality of the situation sharpened. Turning a plane in the sky was one thing. Bringing 30 tons of metal and high-octane fuel down onto a narrow strip of concrete at 110 miles per hour was another. Muscle memory was a steady hand, but landing required a synchronization of timing, depth perception, and nerves that a concussed brain might not be able to sustain. "Manston," Elias said, his voice trembling as the airfield's runway lights flickered in the distance like a row of birthday candles. "I don't remember how to stop. I don't remember how to land." "Don't think about the how, Elias," the voice replied, firm and steady. "Just look at the lights. Your body knows the way home. Trust your hands." The runway at Manston looked like a narrow ribbon of grey silk stretched across the green fields of Kent. To a conscious pilot, it was a target. To Elias Thorne, it was a precipice. As the B-17 dropped below 2,000 feet, the ground became terrifyingly detailed. He could see the individual hangars, the tiny specks of fire trucks waiting with their lights flashing, and the windsock fluttering in the breeze. "Elias, listen to me," the voice from the radio commanded, cutting through the rising roar of the wind. "Don't look at the dials anymore. Look at the end of the runway. Keep your eyes on the horizon. Your hands will take care of the rest." The controller was invoking the Zen of aviation. In a high-stress landing, the conscious mind often overcorrects, leading to a fatal, pilot-induced oscillation. But Elias didn't have enough conscious memory to overcorrect. He was a passenger in his own body, watching a ghost perform a miracle. Without a word from the radio, Elias's left hand reached out and slapped a heavy toggle switch. With a mechanical groan that vibrated through his boots, the landing gear dropped. 3 green lights flickered on the dash. Locked. He didn't know what the lights meant, but a wave of relief washed over him that he couldn't explain. Next, his fingers found the flap handle, notched it down to 20 degrees, and then 40. The aircraft ballooned upward, losing airspeed, settling into a stable, nose-high attitude. He was on the step. The B-17 was now a massive, aluminum glider. The ground rushed up to meet him. The hangars whipped past the side windows in a blur of olive drab. The runway threshold, the piano keys, slid under the nose. "Ease her back," the radio whispered. Elias's muscles obeyed. He flared the giant bomber, pulling the yoke back into his stomach. The 4 engines transitioned from a roar to a soft, rhythmic whistle. For a heartbeat, the plane hung suspended in the air, caught between flight and gravity. Chirp, chirp. The sound of rubber meeting concrete was a violent, screaming friction. The tail wheel slammed down a second later. The B-17 bounced once, a 30-ton skip, before settling onto the tarmac. Elias's feet, acting with a violent, independent reflex, began dancing on the rudder pedals, tapping the brakes to keep the massive tail dragger from ground looping. He didn't know he was braking. He didn't know he was steering. He just felt the vibration of the concrete through the soles of his boots and adjusted accordingly. The bomber slowed, its momentum dying as it rolled toward the end of the strip. Finally, with a long metallic hiss of the pneumatic brakes, the flying fortress came to a complete stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Elias sat in the seat, his hands still fused to the yoke. His chest was heaving. He stared out through the salt-crusted windshield at the grass. He had done it. He had brought the Queen of the Skies home without knowing her name or his own. The door of the cockpit creaked open. The smell of the ground, wet grass, cold mud, and the distant scent of the base's mess hall, wafted in. But as he turned to see the medics rushing up the ladder, a new scent filled the cockpit. It was sharp, distinct, and strangely chemical. It was the scent of the co-pilot's spilled coffee, mixed with the burnt ozone of the radio set. And suddenly, The fog in his mind began to tear. The smell of burnt ozone and cold, stale coffee shouldn't have been beautiful, but to Elias Thorne, it was an earthquake. As the medics scrambled into the cockpit, their boots clattering on the metal floorboards, Elias remained frozen. One of them, a young man with wide eyes, began unbuckling the pilot's harness. As the heavy webbing fell away, the movement shifted a thermos that had been wedged behind the seat. It spilled the last of its contents, lukewarm, bitter dregs, onto a scorched radio wire. The resulting hiss released a sharp, acrid puff of steam. It was a sensory key, sliding into a locked door. The smell hit the back of his nasal cavity and bypassed his damaged frontal lobe entirely, striking the limbic system, the brain's ancient storage unit for emotion and memory. In a terrifying, staccato burst, the fog didn't just lift, it shattered. August 1944. The target was Schweinfurt. The images returned with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the co-pilot, a kid named Miller from Ohio, laughing about a letter from home just seconds before the flak burst. He remembered the crump 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 of the 88mm shells walking their way across the sky. He remembered the sudden violent lurch as the nose plexiglass vanished, replaced by a wall of freezing air and iron splinters. He remembered Miller's slumped form, and the frantic realization that the rest of the crew had already bailed out from the back while he was unconscious. Captain Thorne, can you hear me? The medic was shining a penlight into his eyes. Miller, Elias croaked. The name wasn't a question, it was a realization. I remember Miller. He didn't make it. The identity flooded back in a dizzying wave, his mother's house in Maine with the peeling white paint, the specific weight of his silver wings, the way his wife's hair smelled like lavender. The "who am I?" was answered, but it brought with it the crushing weight of the "what happened?" The amnesia had been a protective cocoon, a psychological shield that allowed his body to fly without the paralyzing weight of grief or the memory of the explosion. Now that the shield was gone, the trauma arrived in full force. He slumped back against the seat, his body finally beginning to shake. The autopilot had disconnected. His hands, which had been steady as stone during the landing, were now trembling so violently he had to tuck them under his armpits. The neurological mystery was profound. The brain had prioritized the procedure of flight over the person of the pilot. To survive, Elias Thorne the man had to be erased, so that Elias Thorne the pilot could function. The memory hadn't been deleted, it had been moved to a read-only file, protected from the electrical storm caused by the concussion. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Elias looked one last time at the cockpit. It no longer looked like an alien room. It looked like his office. It looked like a graveyard. He recognized every switch, every dent in the aluminum, every stain on the floor. He knew exactly how he had landed the plane, and that knowledge terrified him more than the memory loss ever had. He had looked into the machinery of his own mind and seen that, under enough pressure, the human soul can step aside to let the machine survive. The case of Elias Thorne didn't just end with a successful landing. It began a new chapter in the study of the human brain under fire. When the flight surgeons and neurologists at the military hospital began to deconstruct the miracle at Manston, they realized they were looking at a living map of the brain's survival architecture. Elias's experience became a cornerstone of aviation medicine, teaching the world that the mind is not a single entity, but a tiered fortress. The primary discovery was the extreme resilience of procedural memory. In the aftermath, researchers realized that Thorne's concussion had localized its damage to the hippocampus and frontal lobe, the areas responsible for declarative memory, facts, names, and personal history. However, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, the deep, ancient structures where physical skills are hardwired, remained untouched. This taught doctors that knowing how to do something is physically located in a different part of the skull than knowing who you are. For the Air Force, this changed everything. It led to the realization that overtraining and drilling weren't just about efficiency. They were about creating a subconscious backup that could fly the plane even if the conscious pilot was mentally incapacitated. Secondly, Thorne's case shed light on dissociative amnesia as a protective mechanism. Military psychologists argued that Elias's brain didn't just forget because of the physical blow. It chose to stay dark to prevent the system crash of emotional trauma. If he had remembered his co-pilot's death or the impossibility of his situation while at 25,000 feet, the surge of cortisol and adrenaline likely would have paralyzed him. By erasing the man, the brain allowed the pilot to operate with a cold, mechanical clarity. This led to the development of the flow state training used by modern fighter pilots and astronauts. We now understand that in high-stakes environments, the conscious self is often an obstacle. By training a pilot to rely on instinct and muscle memory, you are essentially preparing them to unplug their fragile ego and let the trained biological machine take over during a crisis. Today, the pilot who forgot how to fly is a classic case study in neurological textbooks. It serves as a haunting reminder of the human body's incredible will to survive. Elias Thorne eventually fully recovered his memory, though he never flew in combat again. He left behind a legacy that changed how we view the mind-machine interface. His story proves that we are more than our memories. We are the sum of our repetitions, a collection of skills etched so deeply into our nervous systems that not even a hole in the head can wipe them out. The man might have forgotten the plane, but the plane, and the years spent mastering it, never forgot the man.